This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. Welcome out to what I'm calling session 56 of my end time studies. It's really session one of a new approach to it. Sessions 1 through 55 was me at our Liberty Church dining hall lecturing, and the only person on camera, and there were a group of people there every time. That covered a period of about 3 years. And at the end of my lecture, I would open it up for questions and discussion. And we had some really good discussion times, but we weren't really set up with our camera and microphone to capture that. And that would have been pretty frustrating. So we did that off camera. And some of the best comments were those not recorded. So all the while through those 55 sessions, I wanted to do something along this line, because either from what you heard on those sessions or what you'll hear today, and if we do any more, I'd like to hear your responses. I'd like to hear your ideas. One of the great things about eschatology is that a lot of it cannot be dogmatic. And so you can feel free to share some of your opinions without fear of too much retribution or pushback, hopefully. Hopefully we can do all this decently and in order. And so today is session 56, and I probably chose an overly ambitious subject for this first try, but Daniel 10 through 12. And I decided to choose that because it fits so well into current events and what's going over in the Middle East and Syria and Turkey and so forth. That feeds right into what these chapters are talking about. And the Antichrist, of course, is a prominent figure, especially in chapter 11. So anyway, open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 10 and we'll get started. A lot of this is an experiment because being kind of a new format for me on this, I hope to not do most of the talking. So please join in, make a comment, ask a question. I'll open it up for discussion. But remember to unmute yourself if you do that, so that we don't have to yell at you too much. The amazing thing about these chapters, several amazing things about these chapters. First of all is the setting, the time setting. The first verse says, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long, and he understood the message, had understanding of the vision. So it's 2 years after the time setting of Ezra 1:1. I think I would like to read that because it reveals quite a bit. Ezra 1:1 is the initial decree for them to return and rebuild the temple. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. And of course, that's the Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70 years captivity and the reasons for it. And the reasons for it being 70 is they had violated and avoided 70 Sabbath years every seventh year. So 490 years they had violated that. And probably the reason for violating that was because that takes us right back to the time they demanded a king like the other nations. And so Samuel warned them, okay, but if you have a king, here's what's going to happen. He's going to raise your taxes. He's going to take your children as servants. The demand for more food and so forth to operate the government will be tremendous. And so, in my mind, because the Bible doesn't specifically say this, they decided we can't afford to skip the seventh year. Now we have to support a king and his palace and the whole new government. So for 490 years, they skipped 70 Sabbath years. And so basically God said, this is all at the end of Second Chronicles, that I'm going to remove you from the land for the same amount of time, or judgment will be upon you for the same number of Sabbath years that you missed. You're going to be in captivity 70 years. So that's the reason for that length of time. And the reason that's important is it helps unlock what the 70 weeks are. When you tie it into the reason they went in for 70 years based on 70 missed Sabbath years, uh, it helps you uh, interpret the 70 weeks future in the same way. 70 Sabbath years covering 490 years. So that settles it for me. And anyway, this time setting of Cyrus issuing that decree for Zerubbabel and Joshua and almost 50,000 people to return and rebuild the temple. And now this vision takes place in the third year of Cyrus. So still early in his kingdom, Persian kingdom, Daniel is probably about 90 years old, and captivity for 70 years in Babylon, and then whatever age he was when he was taken captive, if we make it like 15 to 17 or something like that, then this is the third year of Cyrus, he'd be right at 90 years old. And the way this book closes at the end of chapter 12, go your way to your rest, you'll be raised in his own resurrection at the end of the days. This probably closed out his life. I think he probably died very soon after this vision in these chapters. And so if you think about the overall time setting and his role in the decree of Cyrus to send them back to Jerusalem, uh, what role did Daniel play in Cyrus making that decision? Here is they just defeated Babylon. So he has a lot on his plate, Cyrus. So what would cause him to focus on this little group of people called the Jews and issue such an important decree for them to return to rebuild their temple? That would not even be, I would think, on his mind. He had larger, more important things to think about at that point of defeating Babylon. That's where Daniel comes in. Daniel, amazingly, for most of history, when you conquered your enemy, you would kill or put in prison all of their top leaders. But God's providence and sovereignty played a large role in Daniel coming right over into a prominent place in this new empire. I mean, that was unheard of. And having the king's ear and immediately, right away, having a large influence on him uh, is a miracle almost. It's the hand of God. And so, in my mind, and you may have some other thoughts, but Daniel was the one who influenced Cyrus to issue that decree. And Daniel actually may have written it as the chief administrator, and the king just signed off on it because of his respect for Daniel. Daniel, no doubt, was the mentor to Zerubbabel and Joshua and the other leaders of those who went back. So Daniel played a very large, prominent role in that decree for them to return. And every time I go back to the book of Daniel, uh, it seems like each time I end up focusing more on Daniel the person than I do on the visions. As important as they are, uh, his personal spiritual life, his desire to please God, his influence on Gentile kingdoms, uh, stands out to me almost more than the visions that were given to him. And so this is the third year of Cyrus. Now, this is kind of a continuation of chapter 9, because chapter 9, in the first year of Darius or Darius, ever how you want to pronounce that, he gets this vision of the 70 weeks. And it leads right into chapter 10 through 12. And of course, the other major event right in this close time period is the Lion's Den event back in chapter 6. Uh, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, especially for those of us who are a little bit older, is that it was at the end of his life that some of the greatest events of his life and most important events for us happened. Now, I can't prove this, but in my mind, the Lion's Den event was first to bolster his faith so that he would be in a better position than he even was, which was already good, to receive these very important visions, chapter 9 through 12. And so, in a rapid succession, he has the Lion's Den event, he has the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and then he has these important things of chapter 10 through 12. So, the life of Daniel, the man, almost overwhelms the visions themselves. And then the result, then I'll open it up after a few more verses. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. One of the things you'll notice as you go through the book of Daniel is the physical and emotional effect on him in some of these visions. Here he was, an extremely godly man, prayed all the time, and yet these visions were so traumatic that he ends up in bed for 3 weeks. He's not eating, he's not drinking. He's so overwhelmed by them uh, that it has this very deep effect. He says, I ate no pleasant food, no meat or wine came into my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. So his deep faith, his deep prayer life, 90 years old, and it's at the end of his life that these big things happen. What a man of God he was. And I think he probably died very soon after all of this. But before we go on, I know a lot of you have studied the life of Daniel, and you've probably, like me, you end up spending as much time studying his life as you do the visions and the interpretation of them. What would you like to add to what I've already said? Don't be shy. This vision, it says in verse 8, is called a great vision. And then in verse 11, a man greatly beloved. So we have a great vision given to a great man. And there's further verses that talk about the effect this had on him, such as verse 8, no strength remained in me for my vigor. By the way, I'm using the New King James translation. As I go through here, if you're using a different translation and you think it might help in understanding, feel free to read from that. I like to compare different translations. It gives me a better overall look. It says, no strength remained in me. My vigor was turned to frailty in me, and I retained no strength. Then in verse 9, he says, I was in a deep sleep on my face with my face to the ground. So, you just have this kind of maybe thought that he's already so great, so godly, such a deep prayer life, and yet he still had to go through the trauma of the physical and emotional effect of receiving these visions. Um, there's a lot there to consider. Then you go on to like verse 16 and 17. Suddenly, one having the likeness of the sons of men touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth, spoke, saying to him who stood before me, my Lord, because of the vision, my sorrows have overwhelmed me, and I retain no strength. For how can this servant of my Lord talk with you, my Lord? As for me, no strength remains in me now, nor is any breath left in me. So one thought that struck me is he played such an important role in the running of the government of both Babylon and Persia, at least for a while in Persia. What were they thinking when this chief administrator was absent for 3 weeks? I mean, by this description, he wasn't able to fulfill his political and duties for the kings. He was so overwhelmed by what God was revealing to him that he basically was sick in bed. Maybe they just thought he had a bad case of the flu or something. But I wonder what kind of conflict that might have had. And then back to the idea of this being the third year of Cyrus and the decree that was issued for them to return. A lot of you have gone over and read Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1. And that's Isaiah prophesying Cyrus by name and stating that God, through him, that Cyrus would be saying, go and rebuild Jerusalem. Go and rebuild your temple. And that was written 150 years or so before Cyrus became king, before Daniel was born. And that's what leads a lot of people to say, Isaiah was written after the fact, after Cyrus or something, because there's no way such detail could be given so far ahead of time. But there's a reason why at the end of chapter 10 here in Daniel, I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. And I'm glad that was included because that lets us know all of this is inspired by God, and it's no problem for him to name someone so far ahead of even their birth and what they would end up doing. So my thinking is Daniel, being such a great prophet, having the writings of Isaiah probably with him, he may have actually read these verses to Cyrus, impressing on him, you're the one that's supposed to let my people go back and rebuild their city and temple. And it made such a deep impression on Cyrus that he said, you write up the decree and I'll sign it. Anybody have an opinion on any of that? I'm in my mind, go ahead, Noah Ward. Go ahead, Noah.
Well, just, oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just had a couple of quick thoughts. The first, I guess, is that we see this same sort of thing in the Chronicles or in the Kings, when God declares to, I believe it was Ahaz, about his line being wiped out, and declaring by name the person that would come in and do this thing. Why that's significant, I'm not sure, but I think I see that there's any time that we see God dealing directly with his people, I think we see these same sort of patterns emerge. But the other thing that I was thinking, let's see if I can remember what it is now that I'm talking. Oh, historical context. We saw the Medes and the Persians coming in and helping Babylon to conquer Assyria. So I think that we can assume that the Medes and the Persians had a very close relationship, at least for a while, with the Medes and the Persians. Daniel working perhaps with these various government dignitaries as they were dealing with with one another as these nations were dealing with one another. And so it is not beyond beyond the realm of possibility that the Medes and the Persians, that this government had interactions with Daniel throughout this time when Babylon was still in control, when Babylon was still a nation. But it was just a couple of quick thoughts there.
Good, thank you. Anyone else have anything to add? Isaiah 45:1 speaks about Cyrus. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the armors of kings. And if Daniel had read this passage to Cyrus, what deep impression that would have made. And Cyrus actually being called anointed of God. I mean, that's pretty amazing. So to Nebuchadnezzar, to Belshazzar, to Cyrus, to Darius, Daniel was in a position, and no doubt because it's recorded about a few of them, he told them face to face, you're only king because God allowed you to be king. And he chose you to be king for this particular purpose. And you need to live up to what the God of heaven has plans for you. And whether it be Nebuchadnezzar or Cyrus or the others, it seemed to have a deep effect on them spiritually. I don't know to what degree, but they seem to acknowledge the God of heaven, and they seem to have great respect for Daniel whenever he spoke about his God. Let me see, who has your hand up? Somebody raise their hand? Oh, Mike. There you are, Mike.
Yeah, a while back you mentioned Daniel being in the position that he was in, and his influence, and the lion's den. What made me think that you're right, in order for God to elevate himself and Daniel's belief in Yahweh, that rescue from the lions would be crucial, because the king stayed up all night, he couldn't sleep. And then he asked Daniel, was your God able to deliver you? And so when he did show his deliverance, I think that perhaps maybe gave Daniel even more clout with the king. And so that and his influence would be perhaps even stronger.
Yeah, we don't normally think of a man like Daniel needing his faith strengthened and deepened, but none of us reach a point except for Christ where our faith has been made perfect. And so even Daniel needed probably that lion's den event to prepare him for, and then still the traumatic effect it had on his mind and body. But I think less so if he hadn't gone through, or more so if he hadn't gone through the lion's den experience. And this man that starts speaking to Daniel by the Tigris River, in verse 5 and 6, that reminds us very much, doesn't it, of the description of Christ in Revelation chapter 1. And many people say this is actually an appearance of Christ to Daniel. And I suppose that's possible, although overall the message being delivered and interpreted seems to be Gabriel, the messenger angel. And we can say that for a few reasons. First of all, this is a continuation of chapter 9. Gabriel is named by name in 9:21 as giving him that vision of the 70 weeks. So even though Gabriel's not named here, I think this is just a continuation of that, Gabriel's message from God to Daniel. And then you get to a verse like verse 13. He said, well, I've always loved verse 12, do not fear Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand. So Daniel was in deep prayer these 21 days. He was asking for insight. He was asking for illumination. And God heard his prayer from the first day. So you wonder how many prayers were offered in those 21 days. He didn't have to worry about helping run the government or what his next meal was going to be. He wasn't married or had no kids, didn't have that responsibility. So evidently he was alone on his face a good part of the time, praying for 21 days. And you wonder if, the thought ever entered his mind during those 21 days, I'm barely hanging on for dear life here, literally. And Lord, when are you going to answer my prayer? 21 days in that state would seem like an eternity. And yet the reason is given, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. Behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. So some people try to make these visions in 10 through 12 to be actually directly from Christ to Daniel. But a verse like that tells us it can't be Christ himself, because there's no way the prince of Persia could have withstood Christ for 21 days, and he would have never needed Michael to come to rescue him. So I take it to be Gabriel, and if you have other opinions, feel free to say so. And then, of course, the vision of verse 14, I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people, so Israel, the Jews, in the latter days. And I take that to mean exactly what it says, in the latter days, not just in the near future, but in the distant future, for the vision refers to many days yet to come. So a lot of these visions given to Daniel takes us all the way to the end of the last 7 years and the return of Christ and the events connected to it. Anyone have anything to say on that? Daniel's mentor, Jeremiah, and I love to think about that. One of the great things, chasing some rabbits here, but I think one thing that makes the Bible interesting is when you're able to connect the people of the Bible to each other. And so Daniel was a young man growing up in the palace during the time of Josiah, a godly king, and during the time of Jeremiah, who was his spiritual mentor, as well as Josiah, and then the godly high priest, Hilkiah. And one of the interesting things to me about all of that is that in spite of a godly trinity, human trinity, godly king, a godly prophet, and a godly high priest, just within 2 or 3 years after Josiah died, was the first wave of captivity into Babylon. And Daniel was in that first wave. So I don't want to get into the politics of today too much, but I have been hearing people say, this is going to delay God's judgment on us, or whatever they might say about the current political scene. God allowed I guess you would say, a reprieve during the time Daniel was a young boy being influenced by godly men. But their judgment was still set, and it was determined by God, and nothing was really going to change it. Let me see, who raised their hand?
It's me, Tasso.
Okay, hey Tasa.
And this kind of adding some thoughts. Sorry I was late, but
That's okay.
yeah, the idea of where his mental state is right now. The whole, and taking it even from the theme of just the whole redemptive history, is the idea of this pilgrimage, or us being in a strange land. The sentiment of Psalm 137 that comes straight from this idea. Daniel's struggle of just, what's going to happen, especially when the 7 years are about to kind of expire. And it's interesting the fact that he didn't go back to Palestine, right? He didn't go back, and he might be hearing back that the rebuilding of it is not going well. This is at a time where this is close to where, I guess, the first month. So they're not really practicing the Passover, but maybe those kind of thoughts too, of the 3 weeks of mourning and prayer. And I do see this as a Christophany, a theophany, and it is the angel coming over to restore. And you see those 3 exchanges where he's reviving him, encouraging him, and then restoring him to be able to understand what is being told to him. But it's such an important thing for us in the way of application as teachers and pastors to really take this, because really the sentiment also goes into our experience as being these pilgrims in a strange land and having these geopolitical figures, over us, and what do we make sense of that? Sometimes we don't feel victorious, or we don't feel, I don't know. It's interesting. That's why I love taking some of my new members, or even some older Christians who are feeling weary, that take them through First and Second Peter, that really talks about us as pilgrims. How do we do that? It's like a manual for us to get through this, because those are main pretty main things that we have to deal with as Christians, which obviously we'll get to. And this is kind of a prologue to chapter 11, where you hear all these geopolitical figures are going to be coming above God's people, and it seems like the glory of Israel kind of is in decline. It'll never be what it was with David and Solomon. And what happens? What happens to the glory? Our kingdom seems to be removed, and it doesn't seem to come back at all. And so how do you deal with that as a pilgrim who sees these other figures being victorious or on thrones? And I think that's what's being established here in this prologue of chapter 10.
Thank you, Tasso. Mike writes in the chat, what Brother Rick is saying about Daniel and those men who helped shape his character is laid out very well in one of his old sermons, which is posted on the Alethean Landmarks plug. Here is the link if you wish to listen to it. Well, I may have to go listen to it, because I look back at my old sermon outlines and I don't remember preaching it. So I'll have to go look at that. I may learn something from myself. But Daniel is a great example of being a stranger and pilgrim in a foreign land, and the influence that he was able to have. And, I've often talked through the years about, he was probably a eunuch. He wasn't able to experience the joy of marriage and children and home life. He devoted himself entirely to the service of God through serving political leaders and being an influence over them, and he was. His whole life is really amazing. And, my goal was to get as quickly as possible to chapter 11, because there's so much in that chapter. But I got so bogged down in chapter 10 and the preparation of Daniel. He had to go through this several times. And it's, to me, chapter 10 reminds me of the major first part of chapter 9. We love to go right to the prophecy of the 70 weeks. But the prayer that he prayed leading up to it puts the vision or the prophecy in proper context. In that great prayer of Daniel in chapter 9, where he puts himself in with the people and confesses his own sins, we think, well, what kind of sins did Daniel have? But he places himself as a priest, in essence, on behalf of the people, uniting with them as a picture of Christ, even though Christ never had to confess, but the idea of union with his people. And the vision of the 70 weeks, to be properly understood, has to be in context of that great prayer. And chapter 11 and 12 have to be understood in the context of chapter 10. So I encourage you to spend a lot of time in chapter 10 meditating on the various parts. For instance, there again in verse 13, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. That opens up the whole door to the idea of principalities and powers and the battles in the spirit world, and how that there's a whole lot more activity in the unseen world than we realize, and the conflict that's involved in the spirit world. And then the other thought from verse 13 is simply Satan did not want the truth of chapter 11 to get out. He was trying to prevent the interpretation, or the giving and interpretation of the vision, to reach Daniel, because chapter 11 deals so much with his human representative in the future, Antichrist. And the details of it are so involved, and it reveals his man to such a degree that Satan tried to prevent this from reaching Daniel. And there's a lot to be said in that also. Braden Burnham has his hand up.
Yeah, just one place my mind keeps going, and this isn't, this is once again just background on Daniel and Daniel's position, is the idea that I think all this was prefigured a little bit in Exodus 33, where after the people sinned, the Moses takes his tent and goes outside of the camp, and God leaves the people and works from a position of outside the camp. And Daniel, having left Israel as well as Ezekiel, God is dealing with them from a position of outside the camp. I think it's once again prefigured as well with John the Baptist, who God takes outside the camp and deals with him in the wilderness before going back. Just random thoughts in my head I think are worth meditating on in the whole scriptural pattern.
Thank you for those random thoughts, and any other random thoughts are welcome, because one of the main goals of this session, at least, and maybe any future sessions, will be to trigger thoughts in your own mind for your own studies. So whatever seed thoughts we can plant would be beneficial. So this verse 14, to your people Israel, Daniel's mentor Jeremiah called it the time of Jacob's trouble in chapter 30, verse 7 of Jeremiah. And I don't know if you've ever seen this before in that verse, but Jeremiah 30 and verse 7 says, alas, for that day is great. So I've underlined the word great, so that none is like it. It is the time of Jacob's trouble. I've underlined trouble because that's just a synonym for tribulation. You put those two together, and Jeremiah is talking about the Great Tribulation. And exactly what chapter 12, verse 1 of Daniel is talking about, a time of trouble, such as never was, a time of great trouble. Just a kind of a rephrasing in 12:1 of Daniel of 30, verse 7 of Jeremiah. So one of the things that's important in the book of Daniel is to always have in mind the background influence of Jeremiah on Daniel. And not just when Daniel was a young boy in Jerusalem, but we know that Jeremiah wrote letters to the captives. And I think probably, especially Daniel being so high up in the government, had a lot of freedom with correspondence and the sending of messengers back and forth. I think Jeremiah and Daniel probably had ongoing correspondence with each other. And Jeremiah continued to be an influence on Jeremiah's life while Daniel was in the land of captivity. And of course, Ezekiel had great respect for Daniel, including him in that list of 3 names, that even if Daniel were there, God would still judge them. So even his contemporaries saw the godliness and the importance of this man Daniel, and it's all kind of revealed in chapter 10. And of course, we could talk about our own spiritual battles, warfare that we have, much of which we're probably unaware of the source of it. We just kind of use a generic thing of the world or Satan, but there are spiritual forces at work in the evil spirit world working on us all the time. And it's kind of brought out in this chapter. Let me see, what else do I want to bring out in chapter 10? What else do you want to bring out in chapter 10 before we jump into chapter 11? I don't want to get behind too much.
I think Philip, in his recent, I don't know if you guys are watching his Daniel series, but he had mentioned this, like these little scriptures, they're kind of like, what's going on behind the scenes, like the spiritual realm. There's so much to this about like the angels and it's like, okay, whoa, what's going on behind there? Like there's fighting and there's restraint and there's struggle, and which is strange. It's at least how it's put, how it's revealed to us in this particular
Thank you,
verses.
Tasso. I did mean to start off by apologizing to Philip Meany, because here I chose Daniel 10 through 12, and I think Philip is just about through chapter 9 on his lessons at Mount Vernon Rialto. And so I hope we're not stepping on your toes too much. I hope we're actually giving you some added material to help.
Yes, definitely. This will be great. No, we're going to finish chapter 9 next time. We're going to talk about 70th week. So
Okay.
good
And
timing.
I notice others of you have gone through Daniel recently, so it's fresh on your minds. And I often think of that verse in Matthew 24 where Jesus said, "Go to Daniel." So much of what Jesus left out in Matthew 24, he tells us you'll find the answers in Daniel. So Jesus kind of, he could have chosen any of those Old Testament prophets to recommend we go to. For some reason, he chose Daniel because Daniel gives us a lot of details we can't find anywhere else. So it really becomes such a central book to the whole Bible. Somebody else raised their hand. Who is that? Noah Ward
Brother
again.
Rick, we have Brother Noah, and then Pastor Mike Meany from Montana.
Okay. Noah?
I was just going to mention, and I don't want to throw him under the bus or anything, but I know Brother Cliff brought a sermon a couple Sundays ago talking about some of those more spiritual elements that we see going on here in Daniel. And I don't know if it's anything that he was wanting to comment on today, but maybe you could at least post the link in chat, because there are some very interesting things that he brings out in his thoughts on that.
Brother Cliff, you're being called out. You want to jump in?
I don't know of anything to share at this point in time. I think the comments that Noah referring to are probably more related to chapter 12, but we're not there yet.
Okay. We'll try to get there today. Mike?
I was just going to say, keying off of Brother Tasso, and how that we are amazed at what we can't see. These little pieces of verses kind of give hints as to what's going on a different plane of existence. But we see Israel in their warfare. The term is boots on the ground. And I think what we're talking about here is wings in the air. And so they're kind of a combined force to shape the Middle East as God needs it to be shaped. We'll continue to shape it in preparation for Antichrist and all of that. So, there's two planes of existence: what we see, what we live in, and then above us, as it were, all the conflict in the angelic spiritual realm. It's amazing.
There's so many small side studies in this chapter that you can really develop. For instance, Michael being mentioned 3 times in verse 13 and verse 20 or 21, and then, of course, chapter 12, verse 1. And you could almost build a 3-point solid lesson just on those 3 uses of Michael and his overall role in God's plan. He's usually, warrior angel. He's usually doing conflict. He's usually fighting to reveal truth, fighting to bring the word of God to people and things like that. So that's a good side study for you if you want to do that. So chapter 11 cannot be properly understood without chapter 10. It must be seen in the context of the deep prayer involved in it and the effect it had on Daniel. But chapter 11 is often ignored, at least in my experience, for being too confusing and too detailed. And chapter 11 is one of the main chapters. In fact, I'd say overall about the book of Daniel, it's one of the most, it might be the most contested book in the whole Bible, because it gives such detail that many claim that it had to be written after the fact, because there's no way that much detail could be given ahead of time. Of course, that's why, again, verse 21 is in there. It's a scripture of truth. So when you put that into the mix, you understand how easily it could be given in detail. But, you look at the details of chapter 11, and it makes you realize it's kind of like John in the book of Revelation. When he saw certain things, he was greatly amazed, the effect that it had on him, because how do you look at those kind of things? John was able to see. The same thing with Daniel. The effect it had on him was partly because how could you receive a vision like chapter 11 and it not have an effect on you? He had seen empires rise and fall. And yet what he sees in chapter 11, it almost outstrips even what he had lived through. And it goes out into the distant future. And it makes him realize those, and this again is kind of a good side study, all of this makes Daniel realize those 43,000 up to 50,000 with the servants that went back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and hopefully reestablish society in Israel. That's not going to lead to the Messiah coming and setting up his kingdom and establishing peace throughout the earth. There's going to be ages long. And of course, our mind goes back to chapter 2 and chapter 7 of the visions of the empires. And Daniel had lived through the rise and the establishment of the Babylonian Empire. It started well before he was born. It really became at its height during his time in captivity. And then he saw its defeat. And then he knew about the Assyrian Empire before that. He was well aware of the Egyptian Empire all along. And so he starts these visions in chapter 2 and 7. And now in 11 makes Daniel realize we're talking about a very, very long period of time. We're not talking about a quick resolution to Israel being established as the leading nation and the Messiah coming to rule on David's throne. It's going to be way, way out there in the future, because at this point, he hadn't even gotten to the kingdom of Greece with Alexander, and then the generals, and then the Fourth Empire, whatever you make of that. And in his own experience, he would have to conclude we're talking about centuries of time for these empires to rise, defeat the other empire, and then operate for a long time before another empire overcomes them. And the reason I bring all that up is it helps us understand, like what Jesus said in Matthew 24, there shall be wars and rumors of war. Nation shall rise against nation. So we read a passage like that in Matthew 24 and we think, okay, there's always going to be wars and conflicts. No, he's saying that in context of the visions of Daniel 2 and 7 and elsewhere, that from the time Jesus was talking, he was talking about a long period of time before verses 29 through 31, his return and our resurrection and establishing his kingdom over the earth. It's going to be way out there yet in the future. Just those little statements, because him telling us to go back to Daniel tells us to put what he is saying in the context of what was revealed to Daniel, to get the larger picture, the fuller picture, and that these empires are going to take many ages long, centuries long to rise and fall. So don't think things are, so that's why when his disciples ask in Acts 1, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? He didn't rebuke them and say that's a dumb question. It was a good question. Their timing was just confused. And the timing had to be way out there in the future. Anything before we get into chapter 11 else? Now, I'm going to rely on you in the first 20 verses to fill in whatever gaps you want. I am a history geek. I love studying the details of history. I love the history of this time period of Antiochus and the other, Alexander and the generals and their names and their territories. But it's not my plan to get into that very much today. My goal is to race as quickly as I can to verse 21 and try to make the argument that that is where the Antichrist comes in verse 21. Most commentators and Bible teachers do not make that happen until like verse 31 or 36, where it kind of bleeds into the idea of the Antichrist. But I make him come on the scene in verse 21, and most people make 21 through 31 or 21 through 35 to be Antiochus the fourth. But I'll explain real quick why I take the Antichrist all the way back to verse 21. Part of it's for a simple grammatical reason. You go to verse 45 and you look at the personal pronouns of his and him and he. And of course, we know that's talking about the Antichrist. And you follow the antecedent of those pronouns, trace it all the way back. And it goes back all the way to verse 21, and it's talking about the same person. So I am forced to conclude that the Antichrist does not wait until 31 or 35 or 36 or whatever to come onto the scene, that all of it before is Antiochus. I bring the Antichrist in at verse 21. It may be talking about both, blending both to some degree, as prophecy often does. We can give many examples of that. Two of the best ones I can think of right off the top of my head is we love to go to Isaiah 14 to describe the fall of Lucifer, the pride and fall of Lucifer, and yet it's talking about the king of Babylon. And yet we reach a certain point where we say it is talking about the king of Babylon, but the same qualities are that which caused the pride and the fall of Lucifer. And I think most all of us do that. And then in Ezekiel 28, we do the same thing, a description of the fall of Lucifer, yet it's talking about the king of Tyre. And yet at some point we say, well, now it's actually talking about the frame of mind, the pride, the arrogance of the king of Tyre, and it goes all the way back to the original sin of Lucifer. And so prophecy does that a lot. And I think chapter 11 is doing the same thing, that while verses 21 through 31 or 35 may include Antiochus, it's looking beyond Antiochus. It's looking beyond Titus in 70 AD. It's looking down to the end, the final rebel, the final great apostate who rebels against God and his power over his creation and tries to take over, because it's the same sin and frame of mind that Lucifer had in the beginning. He now exhibits it in his man on earth. And I think Toss will raise his hand again. Toss, what do you have?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, those are such great thoughts. I love it. And other part too is the idea that there, throughout all ages, there's been at least somebody to typify or be an example of the Antichrist, all the way back down to from Cain on. There's this enmity between two kingdoms and two cities that these figures kind of come up, and they represent, like, some will typify Christ. King David will come very close, but he's not the Christ. Other people too will typify the Antichrist. I think part of the thing, and I know you know this of me, because our last time of that prophetic burden thing, I think we realize this about each other, that we do divide that a little bit differently. I definitely do it probably, as you're saying, probably as the regular commentaries, I guess, at verse 36. But all of this is definitely laying into that final figure of the Antichrist. And we're told in one way of interpretation is definitely taking the explicit and interpreting the implicit, or the things that we are kind of a little bit more vague. And we know it's explicitly told to us that there's the Antichrist. In fact, there are many Antichrists that are present in every single age. And for my fear, I don't want to be sounding like Hal Lindsey. So in a way that every generation could go, oh, look it's coming together. It's coming together. And then tell people or congregants that, hey, this is happening. It's lining up. And that has happened throughout all generations, putting ourselves up as false prophets. And when, especially when very explicitly, it's told us that the Antichrist will be revealed. We can't even calculate him. We'll understand the characteristics from political figures in scripture, in just in the history of man. All these, Adolf Hitler is not mentioned in the Bible, but he is, because he's a type of Antichrist, and these kind of figures that happen. But this is how we would tackle this. I think definitely, at least speaking for me and Pastor Rick, we probably would disagree where to cut the line, but yet I think the main thing is to realize this is equipping, all of this is equipping the saints and us back then, the time of the Maccabees, the arrival of Christ, the church age, 2024, is letting us know the characteristics and how God is. There's a spiritual warfare, chapter 10, and then here in chapter 11, this is what's going to happen, because Daniel's worried about it. This is going to happen. Israel's not going to be, they're going to be smashed between two kingdoms. It's going to feel like, man, what the heck is going on? But all of this is really to equip us to understand, similar to how scripture uses things that foreshadow Christ. These things foreshadow the figure who will come at the end of the Antichrist. But I love you bringing up the Isaiah thing with the king of Tyre, where he's talking to him, and then you realize, oh, wait a minute, he's not talking to him, he's talking to Satan and cursing him. The same thing happens near the end of chapter 11, and then into 12, you realize, oh, wait a minute, this has nothing to do with any historical figure just yet. It's going to something more ultimate. We start seeing people who don't exist, the Ammonites, the Moabites, back, even at the time of the Maccabees, or the time of Christ arrives. Those people don't exist. There's a symbolic thing that happens here. But I think if we could take this, and a way of knowing this is all typifying what we ought to learn, the characteristics of what the Antichrist will be. And every generation has to deal with that. But let's be careful not to go, let's check the boxes and start being like Hal Lindsey. He had to redo his book several times, but he had answers for all this, because every generation has people who will typify this, actions to typify this. And I think that even Christ saying to us in Matthew 24, where he talks about, there's going to be war, rumors of war, there's going to be all these crazy things, there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be all these things. That is a description of the whole church age, so every time, but it's going to get more intense. It's like it's revolving and the snowballing till it becomes the very end, where these things become the end of this age. But these are things that I feel that we need to know, regardless how we break this up. You know what I'm saying, Pastor Rick?
Thank you, Tasso. He mentioned the Maccabees. We are in the middle of Hanukkah right now, and that great story of the Maccabees and Antiochus, and all of that is in the context of at least the first part of this chapter. I would describe chapter 11 in an overall sense as a detailed description of the ongoing outworking of Genesis 3:15. So whoever you plug in the names and the time period and the ultimate expression in the Antichrist, chapter 11 of Daniel is a detailed description of the ongoing outworking of Genesis 3:15 and some of the major players involved during particular time periods. I think Steve Waters was next. Steve?
Well, just a quick thought. You're making me think about something I find very interesting, is Satan's working behind the scenes. And all of this has to do with understanding the mystery of godliness and the mystery of iniquity. But two quick thoughts regarding that. As we all know, Satan is the god of this world. He's the head of all principalities and powers of wickedness in the unseen realm. But I think of Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus was being tempted by Satan. He showed him all the kingdoms of the world. And I see that as a scene of, going beyond that particular time and space of the whole history of mankind, all the kingdoms of this world. And Satan said, all of this I will give to you if you bow down and worship me. So he's working behind the scenes in every element of all things that are ungodly. And that would even include false religion. His method of operation is deception for the most part. And I think that's where we need to be most careful, is who we're listening to. God's going to reveal his truth to his people. All false religion is really under the control of Satan, no matter how you look at it. So, and then one last thought, I'm reminded of the behind the scenes things when Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 how he fought with beasts at Ephesus. I think that's much deeper than just fighting with wild animals and that sort of thing. He's fighting the unseen realm. So just some thoughts.
Good, thank you. And Noah, you had something?
Yeah, just going back to what Tasso was talking about, one of the things that really stood out to me as I was reading through these chapters, looking forward to the study, was what we find in verse 14 as this drama between the king of the north and the king of the south is playing out really through chapter 11. Verse 14 says, "And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall." Really pointing to, at least in my mind, pointing to the fact that there will be a lot of people throughout history who will try and accomplish what it is that we find the Antichrist really being the culmination of toward the end of chapter 11 here. But they'll rise up in that same fashion. But just like we see many types of Christ throughout the Old Testament, all unable, all incapable of doing what it was that Christ did in fullness, and seeing that fulfilled in Christ, I think we see the opposite picture of that with these many types of Antichrist coming in, trying to accomplish what the Antichrist will ultimately be able to do as he rises up and becomes that king there before he's conquered ultimately by Christ. But just something that it had stood out to me there.
Thank you. So verses 1 through 20 are a sweeping look at the near future from the time of Daniel, the rise of Alexander the Great and the division of his kingdom. And I know if Eric Cooper was on here, he would be greatly disappointed at this point because he's even more of a history geek than I am. And he'd say, let's stop and talk about Ptolemy, and let's stop and talk about Cassander and Antigenes and Lysimachus and Sodaper and all those other leaders that came after Alexander, and where they ruled and how they fought each other. And all that is interesting. I love studying that, but my goal is to get past that today and talk about the Antichrist mostly. You notice these famous kings, king of the north and king of the south. Of course, we make that the Seleucid or Seleucid kingdom and the kingdom of Ptolemy in the south. But you notice in verse 44, there's news also from the east, and that may well be the way of the kings of the east in Revelation. And then in verse 30, ships of Kittim or Kittim, which is Cyprus area, shall come against him. That's the west. Those are the Western powers to some degree will come against him and stop him, at least for a while. And my point is that this chapter names all four directions. And it really feeds into like Zechariah 14, I'll gather all nations. And the focus of every direction on earth is focused on Jerusalem and Israel. The interesting verse in Ezekiel 5:5, God says, "This is Jerusalem. I have set her in the midst of the nations and the countries all around her." God purposely brought Abram to a place and then later a city that would be in the center of things, the focus of the entire world. And that prophecy in, I think it's the one in Isaiah 14 that we say bleeds into the idea of Lucifer and his fall. There's a real interesting verse there that I think ties into chapter 11 here, that the great goal of Antichrist is Jerusalem. He wants to capture, under the power of Satan, his father, the city of the great king, God's city. That's his real focus. In Isaiah 14 and verse 13, of course, it's Lucifer in verse 12. Interesting statement in verse 13. "For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God." So that's the heavenly scene. Now the earthly scene. "I will also," so in addition to the heavenly scene, "I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farther sides of the north." That kind of language in the prophets is often used for Jerusalem, the city of David. And I don't know how in the beginning Lucifer had his mind set on an earthly city that we later call Jerusalem, the city of the great king, Isaiah, Psalm 48:2. But the idea of that, I think, comes into play with his man on earth, the Antichrist. He's going to use Antichrist for the goal that he had in the beginning, to capture everything that belongs to Christ, everything that carries the name of Christ, the prophetic role of Christ at his return. Satan through Antichrist, we see in verse 44 and 45 here, "He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain." So that's back to Isaiah again. His goal is the glorious holy mountain, Jerusalem. But of course, he's eventually going to come to his end. So I would like you to just do your own experiment, because, Tasso brought up the most common view that verses 21, this vile person that rises up is Antiochus. And he was certainly a great type of the Antichrist, with his desecration of the temple, the spreading of pig blood all over, and all the terrible things that he did to the Jews. But take those personal pronouns in what everyone agrees is the Antichrist, verses 36 through 45, and continue to follow them backwards, and it will take you all the way back to verse 21. So it is Antiochus, but it's more than Antiochus. And I think it's more than just the spirit of the Antichrist. I think it is literally things that will happen during the reign of the Antichrist. So my comments I'm going to make from this point on include the Antichrist. You may only apply them to Antiochus. That's your prerogative. Verse 21, "In his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty. He shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue." Well, we know from here and other places that the Antichrist will do it exactly that way. He's called in chapter 7 and 8 the little horn. The little horn. That's because in verse 23, he becomes strong with a small number of people. So I think we all agree that the little horn in chapter 7 is the Antichrist. And the idea of that little horn, this a small time ruler from a small country, is described in verse 23. He becomes strong with a small number of people. That's why he's a little horn. So all of that eliminates what so many people try to predict, that he's the president of the United States, he's the king of England, he's this leader, that leader. No, he comes from a small people, and he's a little horn, and he becomes big because he's an imitator of Christ. As an imitator of Christ, he has a small beginning, like Christ had a small beginning. I think the imitation idea of the Antichrist to Christ is much more common and prominent than we give place to it. So the Antichrist is going to rise up in small conditions, not given the honor of royalty, just like Christ wasn't at first. So many comparisons to Christ from the Antichrist can be found starting in verse 21. He's going to come in peaceably, because in 927 he signs that covenant with Israel, which is a peace treaty. And I know maybe some of you have different opinions about who that prince is of the covenant in 927, but I make that to be the Antichrist. And I may as well give you my reasons right now, because in 927 it connects the sacrifices, which is simply the normal word for daily sacrifices, tamid in Hebrew, and it's the word for normal daily sacrifices. He's going to end those and commit the abomination of desolation. Now, many people make that Christ on the cross, that ending of the covenant and so forth, the ending of the sacrifices. The problem with that view to me is that as Daniel continues to speak about those two events, they're always tied together. They're not separated by 2,000 years or even 40 years if you make the abomination partly fulfilled in Titus in 70 AD. They seem to be tied together in a very close time period. You look at verse 31. Forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices. You see sacrifices in italics, but it's the Hebrew word tamid, Tamid. It's the normal word for daily sacrifices used in the Old Testament. And place there the abomination of desolation. So the abomination and the taking away of the sacrifices are tied together in a very close time period, happening at the same time or very close to the same time. And in this case, it's an evil prince. You may make it Antiochus, but it is an evil prince doing both. And then in 1211, especially, because if you make 31 Antiochus, 1211 would certainly be, in my mind, the Antichrist, not Antiochus. 1211, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So that famous 1260 or 1290 days, I think we all make the last half of the 70th week, the last 7 years. Both of those events in 1211 are placed within that time frame. So I can't take it back to the death of Christ, ending the sacrifices. And in this case, within the same time period of 1290 or 1260, again, it's an evil prince doing both. Certainly, we make an evil prince committing the abomination of desolation. And the fact that they're tied together as kind of one single event with two different parts to it, happening at the same time by the same person, I am forced to make both of them apply, in my mind, to the Antichrist and not able to apply that first part, to Christ. Okay, Tasso.
Yeah, just a clarifying question, and I know me and you, this is another spot that we might see it different, but okay, the sacrifices and offering at the end times. If there's a second temple, who cares about those sacrifices and offering? And why would that be? They themselves are actually abomination, right? What's going on there? Like, why does it care, and why does it become a target? And who is the temple right now of God? And who are the ones actually making sacrifices? And the other question is, this could be for everybody, it is because this is always confuses me, and this is one of the, when we have our discussion, Pastor Rick, I definitely want to get into this and learn from you from this. But it seems like we borrow from dispensational ideas that there is a plan for Israel and a plan for the church. If that's the presupposition, then I understand what my brethren are saying. If we have more of a covenant theology, then this doesn't make sense for me. That's kind of the confusion for me. So, okay, the sacrifices in the temple, they're abomination in themselves. So why would you make an abomination of the abomination? What is the temple now, the true temple of God, and who are the ones making sacrifices?
Let me answer that as best I can briefly. I don't want to just belabor it too much, but of course, the temple today is the church, no doubt about that. But when Jesus was on Mount Olivet in Matthew 24, they were sitting looking at the temple. And he said in verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet, going into the holy place, he was sitting looking at the temple, the literal temple. The glory had already departed. God was not honoring what was going on in the temple at that time. But he still called that place in the temple, in Jerusalem, he called it the holy place. What else would he call it? What else would they know it by other than what they were sitting there looking at? Of course, the temple is still called the temple all the way through the book of Acts. We know that. Paul calls it the temple. We do know in his epistles, he refers to the church as the temple. I accept that completely. But in 2 Thessalonians 2, when he says the Antichrist sits in the temple declaring that he is God, he is quoting almost directly all through that chapter. Not himself in his epistles, he's quoting Daniel and Jesus. He is referencing back to what Daniel and Jesus spoke about. And I think Daniel and Jesus spoke about a literal temple and literal sacrifices, not the spiritual case of it being the church. Paul was not referencing himself, he was referencing Jesus and Daniel. And again, back here in Daniel, these two events are tied together in an evil sense, not a good sense. The taking away of the sacrifices and the abomination. The abomination is not only the sacrifices, the abomination is declaring himself to be God. And clearly in chapter 11, the last part that almost everyone makes to be the Antichrist, clearly his sight is on the city of Jerusalem. That's his focus. And that's where all the armies will be gathered together when Christ returns, because the Antichrist, even those with him and against him, and there will be those against him, will be gathered at Jerusalem, because that's where the focal point will be at that time. And why is he at Jerusalem? Well, that's where he commits the abomination of desolation. Where does he commit the abomination of desolation? In a place called a temple. Now, I think all of us would place him there at the time of Christ's return. Why is he there? And where does he commit the abomination of desolation if not on the Temple Mount, the Mount of God, the literal geographic place that God has chosen in Jerusalem, in the city of David, is on that Temple Mount, whether God accepts their sacrifices or not. From even before the time of Israel, God chose that literal, I will set my king on my holy hill, Psalm 2. I take that literally to be the holy hill in Jerusalem. God's focus is on that mountain. Whether the Jews are doing it correctly, whether God accepts it or not, to me is beside the point. There is a literal place that God has his focus on, and that Antichrist has his focus on. That's all going to come together at the return of Christ. Is that not literally the city of Jerusalem at Christ's return? I think it is all literal. Anyway, that's kind of my short, long explanation. Who has their hand up? Speak up. I don't see you. Right.
It's Gary,
Oh, hi,
Gary
Gary.
Brown. Hey, two quick things I just want to add. First of all, we often say the temple is the church of God, or the church is the temple of God. Um, but in but to be more correct, we need to say the churches are the temples of God because there's temples spread out all over the world, and it's not singular. Obvious, we often just call it a singular thing, but it's not singular. It's temples, it's churches, spread out. So there's a number of them. The second thing I just want to say is, who is seeing this as an abomination? Um, God, I think the people here would be Israel seeing the sacrifices as being an abomination because of everything going on. It's not God's view, but it's the people that are practicing in the temple view this as an abomination.
So, anyone else have a thought on that? Like in 12:11, yeah, I know we're kind of getting away on time. Some of you have other responsibilities. I'm sorry. Uh, I don't know if we want to even talk about having another session to get through the rest of 11 and 12, or just skimming through it real quick. Um, maybe get some feedback on that. I don't know. So, in my interpretation of chapter 11, placing the Antichrist all the way back to verse 21, the idea of the force of a flood in verse 22. So, the flood symbolism that's shown in Revelation chapter 12, Satan comes against Israel like a flood, comes against the saints like a flood. I think all of that is drawn from Daniel. And I think it ties in with the idea of the Antichrist, more beyond Antiochus, swept away, be broken, so that he's going to try to destroy Israel. He's going to try to destroy the saints both. Um, Also, the Prince of the Covenant. I'll give you a little bit novel idea on this one for you to think about. The Antichrist being the ultimate, at least attempted, imitator of Christ. He wants to imitate everything about Christ, but of course it's in a perverted, evil fashion. And I take this Prince of the Covenant, it's kind of a mysterious figure. I think this is the Antichrist John the Baptist person. That there will be another leader or person involved, whether it be a UN president or president of the US or some other Middle East, maybe Saudi Arabia, or some neutral country helps arrange this covenant of 927. And he prepares the way for the Antichrist. He's kind of the one that gets it going and is the one that helps draw it up, all that. That the Antichrist comes along and sweeps him away, sees his John the Baptist figure as someone who needs to go away, but in a bad sense, and sees him more as a rival than a helper. And whoever this Prince of the Covenant is also swept away by the Antichrist wanting to come in and take full power and credit to himself for this covenant. So whoever this person is gets swept aside. And one reason I say that is this idea of the covenant is brought up 5 times in this chapter. And if you go down to verse 28, it's called the Holy Covenant. And in verse 30, it's called the Holy Covenant twice. And then in verse 32, it's simply called the covenant. But I think it's the Holy Covenant that the Antichrist makes with Israel to start that 7-year time clock. And it's a peace treaty that he breaks in the middle with the stopping of the sacrifices, which I'll give you another little tidbit for you to study on your own if we ever get to 2 Thessalonians 2 in one of these sessions. Some of the versions of the Septuagint, which there are a number of different versions, but some of them translate these words, take away the sacrifice, they use the Greek word apostasia. So the apostasia of 2 Thessalonians 2, that most make the falling away of people from the truth of God's people, I think a strong case could be made that the actual apostasia is referring back to Daniel again. See, we always have to think, where in the Old Testament are the roots of this? And the roots of the idea of apostasia is from the Antichrist taking away the daily sacrifices. And I think the great rebellion is the abomination of desolation. When he goes into the temple, declares himself to be God, he is simply committing on earth what Lucifer did in heaven. And we certainly call what Lucifer did in heaven a great rebellion. And now he's working through his men on earth to try to do the same thing against God. And so, anyway, some things for you to think about. Noah, you have your hand up again?
Yeah, I just had a thought as we were talking about these things, and we'll see if I can articulate it in a way that makes sense. But we see sort of a transitionary period when Christ comes on the scene of the acceptable mode of worship, the acceptable place of worship being Jerusalem, and the temple to being these the churches, right? From this physical location there in Jerusalem to a still physical locations, but spread all throughout the world. And we see at the end into eternity that one location being cemented again there in Jerusalem, of God dwelling in the temple again, as he promised Israel that he would there, that his presence would be there. And I wonder to myself if this, and out loud I guess now, but I wonder if this thing that we see here in Daniel chapter 12 is this temple is being set up again, a perpetual or a daily sacrifice being implemented, almost as another as the transition back to that, right? Because we know that God has promised to establish his temple forever. We know that he's entering into the temple there in Ezekiel, entering in through that east gate, and you can't do that if it's not a physical location, if it's not there. But I'll stop there before I ramble on more. But it's just something that came to mind.
Thank you. Brother Cliff Foster posted in the comments chat, if the Antichrist comes mimicking Christ, then stands to reason the Antichrist will have his version of a forerunner of the Antichrist. That's a good thought. Thank you. And at least Braden Barnum and Steve Waters said they recommend another session, because there is a lot more in chapter 11 and 12, and I hate to give it short shrift. I didn't know if this would be a one-time session and no more after this, but it sounds like there's some interest in trying to continue these kind of group discussions in the future. So I would like that. What up to this point would you like to bring up? And then we'll kind of maybe find a way to wind up for today and figure out when we can have another session. So quickly,
Brother
this,
Rick,
yes, go ahead.
I'd like to talk more about, if it's all right with the group here, a little bit more about the kings of the north and the south. In my mind, I've always kind of put this in the future, where the Antichrist will come down from the north. But I didn't really know chapter 11, like I said, there's a lot of detail in here, and raises questions as to, is this historical, all this pushing and shoving between these two kings, or is this future, or a little bit of both? But it seems like if it's future, if it is future, it seems like there's a lot more skirmishes that have to take place before, like you said, verse 21, where the Antichrist makes his appearance. Like there's a lot of pushing and shoving yet to come in the Middle East. We're seeing some of that now. But my question is this, are these verses all future, or are they historical, or a little bit of both?
I
So
think
maybe we could talk about
Brother
that.
Tasso would agree with me that they're both. There's so much of this, it's about both. Of course, all of it was future to Daniel, but from our standpoint, part of it is the past and part of it is the future. The king of the north being the Seleucid or Seleucid kingdom, king of the south being the Ptolemy line, of which Cleopatra was part of that. And they did constant battle. Um, and then I think the reason so much of that is brought out is with the idea that Israel was caught in the middle. And so they were affected by both, sometimes controlled by Egypt and sometimes controlled by Syria, what we call Syria and Turkey and northern Iraq today. Um, there's a particular verse in that great prophecy about the birth of Christ in Micah 5. Some of you may have preached on that the last few weeks, about Bethlehem and the birth of Christ and all that. And then it goes on in Micah 5:5, and this one shall be peace. Of course, that's Christ, both spiritually at his first coming and literally at his second coming. And then it goes on to talk about when the Assyrian comes into our land. That's a euphemism or a nickname for the Antichrist. It's very obvious in the context as you go down and read through it. When he treads in our palaces, we shall raise him up, 7 shepherds, 8 princely men. They shall waste the sword, the land of Assyria, the land of Nimrod. And then it says in middle of verse 6, thus he shall deliver us from the Assyrian. But it's talking about his return. So there are verses like that that lead us to believe that the Antichrist comes from what we would call modern day Syria, Turkey, northern Iraq, that general area. And it is interesting, like Tasso said, we don't want to be newspaper prophets. Whatever's on the headline of the newspaper, we're trying to fit it into prophecy. But it is interesting that right now Erdogan in Turkey is doing his best, at least politically, to break away from NATO and become more extreme Islamic. And that Syria has just been taken over by these rebels in an amazingly swift and easy method. And one thing I find fascinating about that is I read, I forget who it was now, but some world political leader predicted that Syria is so divided among its groups of religion and politics in what we call the country of Syria, that he predicts Syria is going to be broken up into 3 separate countries. And when I heard that, I thought, boy, that sure fits into prophetic language about the 10 and the 7 and the 3. He takes over 3 and all that will happen with the Antichrist. And if you see Syria breaking up into 3 separate countries, then all of a sudden in one of those small, insignificant countries, a world leader arises up, and their goal is to destroy Israel. Then you become pretty focused on that. But this king of the north and king of the south does have a large historical context in the days of after Alexander, the days of the Maccabees and all of that. But I think it again flows over into the end times. I think most of us are coming to the conclusion that 10-toed kingdom, the 10-nation federation, that's 10 and 7, the 7th becomes the 8th, and all the kind of confusing language of Revelation and Daniel and so forth, is more Islamic than it is, or let's say it's more the eastern leg of the Roman Empire more than the western leg of the Roman Empire. We grew up making it the western leg, Europe, the common market and all that. But I think we're finding out it's probably his his confederation is going to be those nations surrounding Israel. And it's also interesting that most of the radical Islamic nations are from the north. The more moderate Islamic nations are from the south. And how that's going to play into those more moderate nations like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, big, powerful nations, wealthy, are going to try to offset the role of Syria, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, those more radical ones from the north, and then all those former Soviet republics that are pretty radical as well. It seems like, in general, that the northern nations are going to be resisted to some degree by the southern nations, all Islamic to some degree, but with different. A lot of those southern ones especially are seeing the value of doing business with Israel. So they want more peace. The ones from the north, in large measure, still want to destroy Israel. And there's going to come a clash between the north and the south in some way yet future. Somebody has their hand raised. Who is that? That is Mike Naney.
Yeah, I think we need to overlay the drive behind the Islamists is to reestablish the old Ottoman Empire and to reenact their caliphate. And so they're waiting for their Mahdi to appear. So everything, like you said, we're talking about imitation, we're talking about deception, and so he will appear as their Mahdi, their Messiah, to establish his kingdom, the Ottoman Empire. And so, we have to keep that. What's behind all of this drive, as Satan drives this whole thing, is him wanting to be on the throne, like you said, and it's playing out through these enemies of Israel. So he's the driving force, but that's the wings in the air, but the boots on the ground are these skirmishes between these actual nations as they make war over there.
Well, there's a great competition in the Islamic world that, they have their own end time belief and end time leader like Christianity does. And their belief is that there's going to be a final caliphate that's going to usher in their final leader, going to turn the world to Islam. And their belief is that it needs to come about through conflict and war. And so that's the reasoning behind a lot of what they do. And the competition is between Turkey. They think they should lead that final caliphate because they were the original Ottoman Empire. But Saudi Arabia thinks they should be the lead in it because they have the holy sites, and that's where their leader came from originally, and of course their wealth. And then Iran thinks they should be because they are the true Muslims, being the Shia faith part of Islam. And they think that all of the Sunni Muslims are apostates, don't deserve to lead out in it. So a lot of, I think, how prophecy is going to work out is how Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia clash with each other, and how the Antichrist will rise up among that and figure out terms of peace, because a lot of it will be against Israel. And I see that covenant that he confirms. He doesn't make a new covenant in 927. Again, I know some of you have a different opinion about what that covenant is. I think he makes strong or confirms a covenant that's already recognized with Israel. And I think the terms of that holy covenant, it says here in chapter 11, is a holy covenant that goes back to Abraham and David. And it involves three things. That covenant will agree to the terms, number one, of Israel's right to exist, which a lot of them now don't recognize that even. Number two, their right to exist in their own land. That is their land. And number three, I think it will include some sort of access to the Temple Mount. And I think those three elements are going to be recognized by the Antichrist and the group that ratifies that covenant. And yet, all of this language in chapter 11 about intrigue and deceit, and he's going to scheme and plot, I think right away he's going to try to figure out a way to break that. He's buying time because I think Israel probably was defeating them in battle. And Israel's tired of war right now. They're trying to find a way to get their people back on their jobs instead of having to volunteer for military service. The nations are going to be beaten down, I think, by Israel to some degree, with maybe help from others. And so that peace treaty will be implemented. And then right away, he'll be seeking for a way to break it. And that's what happens right in the middle of the last 7 years. He determines they can no longer have access to the Temple Mount, and they are to be destroyed. And he'll do everything he can in the last 3.5 years to bring that about. That's kind of my overall schematic of that picture. So it seems like most of you want another session. I don't know when that will be. I don't want to interfere with Steve Waters' session that he has with us the first Saturday of every month. It seems like Saturday morning might be the best time. I know some of you like it in the evening, but some of we older ones, our mind starts going south pretty early in the evening. But when we're fresh in the morning with strong coffee, we're not too bad. Anyway, if you have ideas on that, just share them with me. Any last thoughts? I didn't want to hold you past 10 o'clock. Any last thoughts that you might have? Jay Wheeler says, I enjoyed listening and learning more about these passages, would enjoy learning more. Anyway, some of you have to leave, so any last thoughts?
Yeah, just the idea of the Antichrist. Is that's what we're going to deal with next time if there is another session?
Yeah, I'd like to focus on the Antichrist next time.
Right.
And I do want to deal with chapter 12. Cliff Foster has some good stuff on that, and others of you do. And chapter 12 should not be neglected because it rounds out the whole book of Daniel in such a great way. So we have to deal with chapter 12. Thank you all for giving up your Saturday mornings. I know you have lots of obligations to get ready for Sunday service and all that, but this can become quite important as we encourage each other, share ideas, challenge each other, all in a good spirit, not falling out with each other is our goal. I hope we can accomplish that. And if we continue these, once a month or whatever it ends up being, I hope we'll get some good out of it. So,
Thank you, Brother Rick. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone here on the panel did as well. Thank you for all your many, many hours, years of study and preparation to bring this.
Well, it's important to develop two things. It's important to develop strong opinions about these subjects, but it's important not to be too dogmatic and open to other viewpoints.
And Braden, the Antichrist is a beast too. I would love to hear from you, bro, because I know you know that subject well. So
He's a beast rising up out of the sea. Okay, thank
Braden's
you all.
got a
God
great-
bless. God bless your service tomorrow, and blessings on the coming year for all of you. I'll remain on a few minutes after the recording in case you want to say anything off the recording. Here we go.